Hi guys, welcome to the female endocrinology part of the physiology of this block. A quick overview of what we're going to do. There'll be an overview and then we'll talk pretty extensively about gametogenesis, the development of the ovum and the development of the follicle around it, folliculogenesis, the follicle along with the HPG axis results in generation of many of the hormones that are involved in the menstrual cycle, and we will launch into a very in-depth discussion of the changes in those hormones and how the cycle operates, and we'll finish up with a few words on menopause. So as I mentioned in an earlier lesson, the overview part of the reproductive physiology in this block. This is a double length lesson. It is twice the length of the usual lesson that you'll get from me, and that is because the female reproductive physiology and the endocrinology is quite a bit more complex than the male. So a lot of that has to do, the female reproduction is really interesting in part because it's cyclical or circular. And what that means is that you can pretty much start anywhere in the cycle, and you'll eventually come around and end at that starting point. So we, when we describe the cycle, we'll choose to start at the period of menses, that is, the bleeding and the destruction of the endometrial layer during the cycle. But you can start anywhere and start describing the cycle, and it'll eventually come back and you'll end up where you started. The other source of interest here that's certainly related is the fact that the phenomena having to do with the female reproductive cycle really interacts at two levels. One is a level where you can look at the ovaries and the changes in the follicle, so we call this folliculogenesis. And the other way that we look at it is through the plasma hormone levels, and these actually relate to one another. The follicles change in development under the influence of the hormones, and in turn, the development of the cells in the follicles will cause changes in the hormones that feed back and change the follicles some more. So we have this interaction on two different levels where you can look at the change of the cells in the follicles, and that'll tell you what the changes in the hormones are, and then the changes in the hormones cause more changes in the follicles. And so this interaction on two different levels really makes this kind of an interesting topic. Okay, so let's launch quickly into a further overview of the system. We have different functions in terms of the female reproductive organs. One is, and this is the primary function I'd say, production of the gametes or the ova. A large number of ova are produced starting at the embryological stage, and starting after birth, these begin to undergo what's caused atresia, which is a decrease in the number of ova down to a certain level. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Production of the sex hormones, which drives much of this development, particularly the development after puberty. Union of the ova and the sperms, so we have peristalsis of the fallopian tubes, which sort of bring the sperm swimming up and the ova coming down together so that the magic can happen. And we have maintenance of the embryo and delivery of a viable neonate, basically pregnancy. So these are all functions in terms of the female reproduction that we will be going through in this lesson and the pregnancy lesson. In terms of some of the hormones that we're going to be running into, we introduced estrogen during the overview lesson. A few more a few more details. It is a steroid hormone. You will recall from that lesson that it is made from testosterone. So you need androgens in order to synthesize estrogen, and that is going to be important for you to understand in order for you to understand this lesson. It is stimulated, the release is stimulated by FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and FSH stimulates aromatase, which mediates the conversion from testosterone to estrogen. So you increase the activity of that enzyme and you get more estrogen. LH stimulates thecal cells. So we have two different kinds of cells here in a typical follicle. The granulosa are the ones that really technically produce the estrogen. The thecal cells produce androgens, and these androgens serve as precursors to the synthesis of estrogen, and so these two things are necessary, and they work together to make for more estrogen. Like all the steroid hormones that we're going to talk about, these are primarily bound to plasma proteins. I mentioned that in an earlier lesson. And estrogen is necessary for ovulation. We'll talk about that for sure during this lesson, and it produces the secondary sex characteristics, which I believe a lot of which we talked about in the overview lesson. Progesterone is another hormone that we're going to run into increasingly as we go along in this lesson. It is also a steroid hormone, also bound mostly to plasma proteins, and it mediates alterations to the uterus. It stabilizes the endometrial layer, so we have this nice big thick layer that implantation can take place in, and that growth of the fertilized ovum can take place in. And it also stimulates the growth of the breasts and has its role in that. And then we have inhibin, which is a glycoprotein, not a steroid hormone. Its stimulus for release is FSH, and its primary purpose is to inhibit the release of FSH from the anterior pituitary. And as we'll find out, that is particularly important in the female cycle after ovulation, where we're trying to get these gonadotropins under control after a LH spike and release of the ovum. Okay. The menstrual cycle is a 28-day cycle, more or less. It is variable across the population, and between individuals, that length seems to be primarily dependent upon the length of this follicular phase. It seems to be the phase that varies the most, and it seems to be the primary determinant of how long that cycle is going to be for you if you are a female. It begins at puberty. Okay, and ends at menopause, of course. So we have the menses part of the cycle. This is bleeding caused by the destruction of the endometrial layer, and again, this is built up during the luteal phase to sort of facilitate implantation and nutrition of a fertilized ovum should fertilization take place. This is followed by the follicular phase of the cycle. And we'll be talking a lot about this phase in the first half of the lesson. This is where follicles, which develop up to a certain point pre-puberty and then stop, are recruited and then selected so that a dominant follicle is eventually chosen during the process of growth and development. And then that dominant follicle is going to ovulate. That is, it's going to the ones that are not dominant eventually sort of die and atrophy. The one that is the one that does rupture is the dominant follicle. It releases its ovum into the fallopian tubes. That's ovulation. And then that is followed finally by the luteal phase, where the follicle regresses into what's called a corpus luteum. And this produces hormones, primarily progesterone, that maintain that endometrial layer of the uterus And should fertilization take place, that endometrial layer will be important. If it does not take place, the cycle comes back to the menses stage where that layer is disintegrates and bleeding takes place. Okay? So that's a quick overview of the female reproductive cycle, some of the more important elements. And I'll cut this video off here, and then we'll start in the next video with gametogenesis and folliculogenesis. Thank you.